This is using the evidence for teaching public health, a webinar sponsored by the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health as part of our 2020 virtual annual meeting series. We look forward to hearing your comments and questions in writing anytime during the webinar. You click on the Q&A button right there at the bottom of your screen and type into the box. Later on in the webinar, Marc is going to call for evidence from all of you. We're going to invite you to use the chat function right there at the bottom of your screen, and you type in your evidence right there in the box that pops up. Now I'm pleased to welcome our presenters today. Our moderator is Dr. Marc, PhD, CPH. He's Chair and Development Dimensions International Endowed Professor at the University of Kentucky College of Public Health. Marc is also a member of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Task Force, where he chairs our teaching work group. Joining him is fellow presenter, Dr. Sophie Godley, DRPH MPH, Clinical Assistant Professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the Boston University School of Public Health. Sophie is also a member of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Task Force on the Teaching Work Group and is the lead author on a coming manuscript from that working group. Dr. Godley also is the winner of the 2011 Early Career in Public Health Teaching Award. Please join me in welcoming Marc to the mic.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. Sophie and I are both delighted to be able to present this session to you, even if it does have to be, live from my basement as opposed to in person at the annual meeting. Liz mentioned earlier that this grows out of the work of the ASPPH Teaching and Learning Task Force. And I was watching the attendee names roll in as y'all were registering. There's a lot of members of the task force on the call. And so one of the things I want to say by way of beginning is that a lot of what particularly I am going to do today is channeling a lot of great work and thought that came out of all of the members of the task force, some of which will be reflected in the manuscript that Sophie has taken the lead on writing. To get us started, the fundamental idea that underlay the work that our task force started with is the idea that public health is itself an evidence-based discipline. So we talk with our students and we spend a lot of time thinking about having evidence for our intervention programming and for the work that we do. And we on the task force then wanted to ask, how do we bring that same evidence base and that same notion of doing things that we know work and that we know are effective to the strong work that we do as teachers throughout the range of levels of students and types of programs that we cover in ASPPH. So to get us started thinking about that question today for the webinar, I want you to take a minute and think about this idea of evidence for teaching and the effectiveness of our teaching at encouraging and engaging our students in learning about public health. So please take about 2 minutes. And what we would like you to do is to think about this question. How do you know that your teaching works? What do you see when teaching works? What do you feel? What do you hear from your students? What kinds of things do you measure? And as Liz mentioned earlier, there is a chat box associated with your Zoom webinar. If you don't have it open already, there is a little chat icon down at the bottom of the screen. If you would click on that, just type in your ideas. How do you know teaching works in that chat box? I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to do that activity, and then we will come back and we'll talk about it a little bit. So please type as many ideas as you can in that chat box, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, and to just to add to it, if you're starting to run out of ideas, you can also ask, what sorts of things could we see, hear, feel, or measure? All right. Thank you for that amazing array of ideas. One of the things that I always talk about with students, and especially with teaching assistants when we are doing teaching and learning stuff, is that teaching is often doing things without a net. And this is an example of that, because something that I tried 15 times as a sample before we did this worked perfectly all the times that I tried it, and is not working now. So I'm going to shift gears very quickly. And what I'd like to do is have you read over some of these ideas that are in the chat. Okay. So we have all sorts of things: engagement and enthusiasm, light bulbs pop in students' heads, connections to each other, to the field, to other ideas. Despite the lag time, the most valuable work comes from graduates in the workplace. I'm going to show you a screen for a moment. And what I'd like us to do is to think about how these different things that are in our chat can potentially give us evidence for the effectiveness of our students' learning. So if you would, keep working in the chat window and think about, across this range of ideas, what are the themes? What are the categories? If we are going to create a definition for evidence-based teaching, what is that definition? What do we have? What do we know? And I'm going to start just typing a few ideas here while you're doing that. And I see some categories coming in. So we have change in students, both minds and hearts. Application. Changes in health outcomes, ability to engage in critical thinking, willingness to try to take risks, changes in knowledge level, self-efficacy, motivation. Okay. I'm going to scoot back up here in the chat for just a moment to do this. The look on their face when they get it, when they can teach others. So keep typing those ideas in the chat, and we can come back to them a little bit later in the question and answer session if we have the time. But one of the things that I'd like you to appreciate coming out of the list of the things in the chat, and I do encourage you to read through it in more detail, is that there's a lot captured here above and beyond what we typically do as evidence for student learning, which is that we give, some tests, we give maybe a paper, an assignment, a presentation, something like that, and we use, grades on it as evidence for outcomes. And of course, those things are all valuable, but there's much more richness in what we have in our brainstormed list than just simply test scores. So can they teach other people to understand the concept, to apply the concept as a very practical way of measuring knowledge? What kinds of changes do we see not only in our students' minds, but in their hearts, and that capturing of both components? I love a lot of what was said early in the chat about not only the knowledge that students gain, but their affect and their feeling towards public health. So are they engaged and enthused in what's going on? What can you see when they're getting it, and the kind of affective change that comes over students? The kinds of learning outcomes that we have on the list also go well beyond just the knowledge domain. So being able to increase students' motivation, increase student self-efficacy, and so on. And as we work our way through this session, I want you to think back to the richness and the set of things that we've developed here in this brief exercise. One of the things that happens a lot with evidence-based teaching is that when you say we should teach and we should make sure that our students are learning using demonstrated best practices, and we should gather evidence that they're doing so, no one disagrees with you. It's a statement that's hard to argue with. But by the same token, when we then say, well, what does evidence-based teaching look like? It's a much harder question to answer. There's one version of answering that question that's really a kind of, I know it when I see it answer. And that's an okay starting point, but it doesn't really work for promoting evidence-based teaching and learning and trying to do the work that we hope to encourage all of you doing, of incorporating these practices in our own classrooms, as well as enabling and working with our colleagues to do so. So in today's session, we hope to give you a sense for what evidence-based teaching looks like and feels like and sounds like, and what students can do afterwards, as well as give you at least the start of a roadmap for how you can incorporate those kinds of evidence-based practices in your own teaching and learning work. And with that, I will wrap up this section. And I'd like to turn the microphone over to Sophie Godley. Sophie will pick up where we left off here in talking about the definitions of evidence-based learning and teaching. And she will give you an example of what evidence-based teaching looks like in the classroom and in an actual public health education context. So take it away, Sophie.
Thanks so much, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending where you are. I'm delighted to join my colleagues in welcoming you to this virtual session. We've been very much looking forward to talking to you about these amazing opportunities as we see them. And I want to start with this image. This is probably one of my favorite pictures of my son. I should note he's a couple years older now. So this is Leo in the blue shirt, and then in the red shirt behind him is my nephew, David. And this is one of my son's most powerful and favorite learning experiences, which is when he had the occasion to be taught by the gentleman that you see wearing those phenomenal overalls, or suspenders, I should say, about blacksmithing. And it was the most hands-on, dirty, filthy, exhausting 2 days, I think, of Leo's life. And I learned so much in watching him learn in this way, just from how hot it was, how uncomfortable he was, and how much he loved it. So I think about this sometimes when I think about our work of teaching and learning, and how learning is not always tidy. It's not always comfortable. And when we're thinking about our work, I always like to come back to this idea that the stakes in public health are so high that what we're trying to do, literally, when we change experiences for students is, sorry, I'm just checking. Okay. We are potentially having such a large impact because we're not teaching students just to interact with one person, but literally at the population community level. So we have such a huge responsibility in terms of teaching effectively and really meeting our outcomes, getting across what it is that we're hoping students will learn from our courses. So I want to pause for just one quick second and just thank my fellow conspirators on this. So Betsy, Viviana, Nyla, Jessica, Kara, Emily, and of course, Marc. We're the team that has been, and Liz, absolutely nothing happens without Liz at ASPPH. We're the team that has been working on this evidence-based teaching in public health or evidence-based education in public health paper. And one of the really cool things that we have done is to put the these two things together. So this idea that for many of us who, especially those of us who are practitioners before we became faculty or teachers in this work, we're so familiar with this idea that public health has to be based in evidence. It has to be based not just in, I know in my work with adolescents, I was often working with people in communities who would say, well, we do this thing with the teens because we know it works because they really like it. And we, the scientists, the public health folks, would have to say, okay, I'm glad that the kids are enjoying it. That's great. That means they're going to attend. But let's talk about outcomes. Let's talk about evidence. Let's talk about what it is that you're trying to get across. And how do you know if you've actually achieved that? So when we're teaching public health, how can we not also be as rigorous in insisting that we are very clear on what the goal is? So just like in public health, the goal can't be that students like you, right? That's not, we wouldn't say that that's an appropriate or a strong enough outcome. We want them to engage in public health. We want them to learn new things. We want them to develop new skills, have new capacities. So that clarity on the goal is just as important in our teaching as it is in the practice of public health. There's some other parallels too, engaging key stakeholders. We hopefully would not go into a community and undertake a project without talking to the very people involved. So shouldn't we also be doing that if our teaching is going to be evidence-based? Then we got to do a survey. We got to look around. What's working? What's the evidence that's available? Then we have to try it. We have to implement our strategies. We've got to evaluate it. And ultimately, we have to publish. And I want to say one more thing about tailoring. So I think now, more than ever, given sort of what we're all collectively experiencing, the stark differences in resources that some of our students have, at least in my experience teaching right now, are coming even more to light. So students who were struggling before this all, started to happen are struggling even more. Students for whom equality was achieved by virtue of being on campus are now back in challenging situations at home. And so I just want to sort of underline here this idea about our responsibility of making sure that what we're doing is tailored for to be the most effective for the people who are sitting in front of us. So if we're working with incredibly diverse populations, how do we meet their needs? If we're working with people who have not practiced public health, how do we meet their needs? If we're working with people who are, mid-career professionals, what they're going to need and what our goals are for them are going to be inherently different. So what I want to do just briefly is give you a little bit of a description about how I tried to transform some of what I was doing in my public health classroom. So this is specifically an example about my Essentials of Public Health class, which is a big intro class. We have about 100 students every semester, so I teach it twice a year. And I've taught this course now for 10 years, believe it or not. I can't believe it. But one of the things that always happens in this course is that I have, and as I'm sure many of you have this experience in public health teaching, I have a lot of students who are, I call them pre-med escapees. Sometimes they have escaped from the pre-med track of their own accord, and sometimes they have been very painfully removed from the pre-med track because of academic struggles. And so they are searching, they are lost, and they are searching. They don't know what to do with themselves. They're worried, they're anxious. They thought they wanted to do one thing, and now they're in this kind of state of confusion about what to do next. And so in that moment, they show up in a public health class. And I absolutely love the moment in class when we talk about an analogy that I know my dean, Sandra Galea at BU has used, and probably all of you have used this image or this type of image in the past. So what we do with the students is we put up this image, and then we have usually a really dynamic and interesting conversation, even with 100 people, you can do this, where we talk about what does it mean to work upstream? And we talk about if the problem, when you look at this image, if you can imagine that the problem is that we have people who are drowning, people who are in absolute crisis, suffering. What do you need to know? And where do you personally see yourself? And so the students brainstorm and they discuss, and some of them say things like, well, don't we need to figure out why they're falling in the river? And then I love this. One student will always say, I think we need lifeguards. That's what we need. We need lifeguards. And then somebody will say, build a wall, which used to just be a neutral thing to say and now is not. And then someone will counter and say, build a bridge, which is always really fun. And then we back up, right? And then I say, okay, let's take all that energy and all those interesting ideas and let's label those with public health jobs. So if you're in the river, you work in an ER. If you are on the shore holding up a big sign that says, don't fall in the river, you're in health communications. If you're the person who's like way up on those cliffs looking down and analyzing what's happening, maybe you're an epidemiologist. So what we try to do is talk about how there's a million ways to save people's lives. There's a million ways to prevent people from falling in that river and suffering. Where's your role? Are you the lifeguard? Are you the tugboat captain? Are you building a bridge? Are you holding a sign? Are you teaching people how to swim? So it's got some great analogies for really having students investigate their own internal thinking about where they belong. And what I love about teaching public health, which is so fun and so exciting, is that we're all in, right? We're inclusive. There's a place for everyone. And that's such a joy to teach them that way. So what this is an example of is something called transformational teaching. And the idea here, and I want to just be mindful of time, so I'm hoping either Liz or Marc will yell at me if I'm going over. So this idea about transformational teaching is that you build relationships with students. So students and faculty have a relationship, and they are collectively building knowledge. So I always think about, the risks that we take in building relationships with students, authentic, genuine, loving relationships. And I'm going to use that word, which is maybe a scary word to use in the context of higher ed, but I think is a really important one. So this image on here is me with a group of my TAs and students who I had over for a meal. And the reason I show that is just because I learned so much about myself as a teacher and an educator once I read some of this evidence that showed, yes, people learn when they are loved. People learn in relationship. And if we're going to have really hard conversations about racism and white supremacy in public health, which, by the way, we absolutely must be having. Those go so much better when there is a relationship between the faculty member and the students. And I often will ask students to think about a teacher that they loved when it's usually elementary school. Somehow, like, once kids hit puberty, it's like they're not allowed to love their teachers anymore. But so we talk about, I'll ask them to think about that, like, who's a teacher that you loved? And they'll name this elementary school teacher, hopefully. And I will always say to them, here's the big secret that nobody ever wanted you to know, which is that teacher loved you back. And so I believe so much in this idea, this power of transformational teaching, that we build knowledge together, and that there is this intentional relationship between faculty and students, and we create knowledge together. Okay, so I want to end with this. So here's David and Leo again, and now we're joined by Natalie, and then we're joined by two other Whatnot and Mayu, these two other kids in these pictures. And the reason I wanted to put these up is because, so neither of these are particularly great photos, and I think what's hard about the work around evidence-based teaching and learning is that it's really hard to capture the evidence. So in one of these images, so this is on a family trip that we all took to Cambodia, and one of these is a picture of a beautiful place, but the kids all look terrible, right? They look miserable, hot, you know, Leo's got his eyes closed, like not a great look, right? And then in the other picture, they're so happy because each of them got to hold a kitten, but you have no idea that that's in Cambodia, right? And there's this weird blue line because, like, my phone did something funny, I don't even know. But so you can take a great picture. You can take a picture of a beautiful place, but it's not in focus. Or you can take a picture of something important, but you have no context. And so now it's, the nice thing is now I get to turn it over to Marc, who's gonna talk about this dilemma, this issue about how we best capture the evidence.
All right. Thank you so much, Sophie. And so my sense of where people are at this point in the conversation, if you're anything like me, is that you heard Sophie talk about her classroom experience and the power of this transformational learning, and are thinking, yes, I want that for my students. And more broadly, we know from the activity that we did at the beginning that we're looking for a variety of things in our classroom outcomes and things beyond just straight up knowledge on a test. So we want the engagement, the enthusiasm, the light bulb popping when students get it, the aha look on their faces. We want students to have self-efficacy in addition to knowledge. We want students to be able to apply their information to new contexts. And we want that feeling that students love the learning and love the classroom that's going on. And that in turn, they know that we love them, which I would agree is a tremendously important outcome. What that requires, if we're going to do it in an evidence-based way, is thinking about both how we teach and how we evaluate what we have taught in ways that can become evidence-based. And you can end up with the feeling in these kinds of situations, like you know exactly what you want to build, and you know exactly what you want it to look like and how cool it can be. And at the same time, what you have is not a finished Lego car. You have a pile of information and knowledge and things that you want to get across in your course that you have to start with. And so the question is, where do you go? What's the roadmap that you can use to incorporate these kinds of evidence-based teaching practices in your work as an educator? And here I want to once again say that what I'm doing is channeling a very much group effort, knowledge base. So the ideas that I'm going to talk to you about for a few minutes here came originally from the ASPPH leadership and leadership staff, from Laura Magana, who is the president and CEO of ASPPH, and challenged the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Working Group with these ideas. They were fleshed out and developed by all of the members of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Working Group, and in our particular group, a teaching subcommittee. And I get to tell you about them, which is super exciting. So what we would suggest is that if you're at the point of thinking, yes, evidence-based teaching is something that I would like to do personally, or if it's something you're already doing personally, yes, I want to think about how I can mentor and grow and develop my colleagues and the others around me to do it, we'd suggest a four-step process. The first thing to do is to start by consuming the public health literature. There's a lot out there on evidence-based teaching and learning. And I will say it as an aside, my daughter said that the one thing that I had to do if I used her picture was to assure all of you that she is much older now. She is 9 now and does not look like this picture anymore. And so I've done my due diligence by doing that for you. But we want to consume the literature on evidence-based teaching and learning just like Desi has. An important starting point is to think that what makes something effective is to do teaching that is based on the way that our students learn, in exactly the same way that we teach students in our health behavior courses, theories of behavior and behavior change, because they have to understand those to intervene. And when we're doing environmental health work, we think about how transmission of environmental toxins happens, because you have to understand that in order to fix and so on. By the same token, we have to understand how learning works in order to do it effectively. And so the first step is to consume and to start to learn evidence-based practices. And what I put on here on this slide is just a few of the sources where you can learn the evidence-based for evidence-based teaching and learning. As a starting point, even before you get to specific course design activities, having an understanding of how learning and teaching happens, and how people effectively engage with, learn, and are able to apply and remember new information is critically important. One example of that is the technique that we used at the beginning. So we know that having people develop their own knowledge structures and develop their own ideas leads to greater retention, greater ability to apply than simply giving them a framework to look at. Sophie mentioned the importance of the affective engagement with learning, and that sense of loving the teacher, loving the student, loving the classroom as an important part. And we know that that motivational and affective piece is tremendously important. So even in the learning here, you see applications of some of those principles to the things that we're doing. So start by consuming, learning evidence-based principles, learning frameworks for how teaching and learning operates, learn in Ken Bain's book, What the Best College Teachers Do. And then you get to a point, again, back to the parallel with evidence-based public health practice, where we can move from consuming to practicing evidence-based teaching and learning. One of the wonderful things about our field and the field of education more broadly is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you don't have to create your own evidence-based teaching practices. There are a wealth of things that are available to you where you can take an existing evidence-based teaching practice or an existing evidence-based assessment practice and use it in your work exactly like we do with evidence-based disseminated public health interventions. Here too, there are a variety of sources. There are texts that have evidence-based engagement techniques and assessment techniques. There are journals, both things that are specific to work we do in different areas of public health, like pedagogy and health promotion, and journals that are broader audience, that have published examples of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And then I will also give a shout out here and in the next section to taking advantage of your teaching and learning programs and offices on campus. So typically those offices have folks who are delighted to talk to you about engaging evidence-based teaching techniques. They can give you specifics of what's available to meet particular needs and help you think about how to engage them in your classroom. So you move from consuming and understanding principles to practicing by using existing techniques and modifying them to your context or applying them in your own classroom. And then eventually we should suggest that as you develop as an an evidence-based educational practitioner, that you move to the point of generating your own evidence-based practices. One of the things that we should mention that's been implicit throughout what we've done here, but that I'll make explicit here, is that everything we're talking about with evidence-based teaching and evidence-based learning starts from the point of, what are the learning outcomes you want your students to achieve? What do you need to assess to know that they've met those learning outcomes? And what do you need to do with them, actively engaging them in learning in order to get to those outcomes? Sometimes you will find existing evidence-based practices that you can apply to your own work. And when you don't, you'll eventually be in a position where you can generate your own examples. Here too, there are resources to help. So there are great books on how to do course design and unit design and activity design based on evidence-based principles. The two that are here happen to be two of my favorites, but there are many others also there. And here is another place where your teaching and learning center can be tremendously helpful to you in providing consulting and providing advice on developing your own learning objects and generating new evidence-based teaching and learning materials. And then the last thing that we would encourage you to do as a core component of all of this is to document what you're doing in your teaching and learning. From an evidence-based public health practice, you don't know that an intervention is effective unless you assess it to see if it's effective, right? You really can't call an intervention evidence-based if you don't assess and see if it worked. By the same token, thinking about how you document and demonstrate the effectiveness of the evidence-based teaching work and the evidence-based practices that you are creating is a critical part of then transforming the field and thinking about where we go. Sometimes this documentation may be simply informal for your own work. So doing a process evaluation and an outcome evaluation, much as you would in an intervention, so you can then swing back and improve and ensure that your students are learning is certainly critically important. But we would finally encourage you to think about formally sharing and publishing the practice, the adaptations that you make to existing practices or the new teaching materials that you generate. That kind of publication practice is how we grow evidence-based teaching in public health, how we develop new materials for people to consume, new off-the-shelf things that they can grab to practice as new practitioners are starting their own evidence-based teaching and learning journey. And ultimately, that entire process and framework of doing evidence-based public health ensures that we get to the kinds of outcomes that we talked about at the beginning in terms of student behavior, in terms of student affect, in terms of skill sets. And it enables us to not only encourage that kind of evidence-based teaching and learning in our own classrooms, but to really grow it as a core principle in the field. So with that, I will turn back over to Sophie one more time. Sophie's going to share with us some sort of bigger picture takeaways and ways to think about moving forward with our evidence-based teaching and learning journey. So Sophie, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. One of the takeaways that I wanted to highlight and demonstrate was this idea about visual learning and memory, and some of the evidence that we have in adult learning and memory that really highlights the role of visuals and visual learning. And you hopefully have noticed, Mark and I have a very similar style in terms of we like to have lots and lots of pictures, things that we hope will trigger people's memories and images that will stay with you. So I wanted to share why are we all still doing this, right? So this is if you Google terrible PowerPoint slides, this one comes up. And we do it anyways, right? We put too much text on our slides. We put graphs. We're particularly bad about this in public health. We put terrible graphs in. We have them out of order. We can say things like, I have said this out loud myself. I know you can't read this, but it's important. So why do we do that? I have to tell on myself, right? So this is one of my slides. This is a slide from my class. The last time I taught it was last spring. And I was like, oh, I should get an example of a bad PowerPoint slide. And I was like, oh, I should look at my own slides. And here you go, right? So I added the stop sign. Trust me, without the stop sign, this slide is even worse. Who's going to remember maternal and child health programs and 1935 Social Security Act with this terrible list, right? It's boring. It's totally uninteresting. What is the order? Does the order really mean anything? So anyways, why do we keep doing this? So I have been trying something, again, based on the evidence that students are and adults' brains are much more likely to remember things when you have to engage in a physical act, when you have to apply meaning to something, when you have to be creative. And so what I've started doing is this particular handout that you see here. So this is my public health intro class. This was something we did at the beginning of the semester. And the idea is called window painting. And what we do is I'll hand out this little handout, or they can even just do it with a piece of paper. And I'll say, okay, make a window pane. And I want you to draw, 6 or 8 or 10 images of what you learned today. And fill in those little boxes and then turn to your neighbor and explain them. So like an example would be if we were talking about epidemiology, which we do, and we were telling the story of the cholera outbreak in London, someone might draw a pump, right? A water pump from the infamous Soho water pump, and use that as a way to remember cholera, a way to remember the location where it was, and the act of drawing it and then explaining it to someone else helps that become sort of integrated. And then what I love about this is then I can refer back to those images and those ideas and trigger people's memories so that they then can recall and apply what we talked about much earlier in class. One of the other sort of really interesting things in the research about learning is that it's some of the best evidence shows this concept of scaffolding, which you've probably, if you've been to one of these workshops, may have heard this term. So it's this idea that you build on what you have previously covered. And I love thinking about classes as a big arc, right? So what we teach and learn in January means something different in May. And it's been revisited, it's been recalled, right? Perhaps with the visuals, or a story that we've told, something that they themselves have integrated, and then they've applied it or they've thought about it in a assessment way. So the last step of this process is to intentionally have students reflect, to think, what did you learn? How did you learn it? How did you feel when you were learning it? What was hard about it? What was interesting about it? So I just had, we're nearing the end of the semester, as I'm sure many of you are. And so one of my other classes, they just finished producing these podcasts as their final assessment for the semester. And my thinking these days is that the best part of that assignment is when they write a couple-page reflection on what they learned and how they learned it. Because it's more than the actual sort of act of like, did they do a good podcast or not, which is a little bit subjective. The process of thinking about what they learned and how they learned it as a skill, that they're going to have forever. And I know they will use that again. So it's about making that learning and why are we doing this and what do I want you to get out of it and what did you get out of it, just being more intentional and being more explicit about those goals as a teacher, again, has this evidence that students retain more, they absorb it more, and they're able to recall it and then apply it in a different way. Okay. All right. So I think that's my section done, and I'm going to turn it back over to Marc. And I think now we're going to do, I think we're doing questions at this point.
Yeah, so just a couple of things by way of wrap up. Thank you, Sophie, for that. One of the themes that you've heard repeatedly over the course of the past 45 minutes or so is that there are things in teaching and learning that work, and there are things in teaching and learning that don't work. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind and that we need to appreciate is, much like the PowerPoint slide that's nothing but text and students can't possibly read it in the time provided, many of the traditional ways of delivering education are trying to screw in a screw with a hammer. They actively don't work with what we know about how people actually engage with material, what motivates them to learn it, what they need to do to actually be able to address and apply that material. And so the question is getting people to what does work. One of the things I wanted to mention on the subject of things that don't work is that the activity that I did at the beginning that completely failed to work as planned because the technology didn't play nicely with me. But there were two things that came up in the things that people said as how do we know when students learn? One was that students ask questions, and the other is that students give feedback and they give constructive criticism on what happened. And one of the things that struck me as I was looking at both of those is that both of those answers are very different than what you might get in a traditional lecture and knowledge delivery kind of a course. Because the idea in delivering a lecture is that you deliver it very well and the students get all the information. And if they have questions, that shows that something didn't go right, you go back and you change the lecture for next time. And what we've argued in our definition for how students learn is that answering questions, asking questions is a good thing, right? It shows that engagement and that enthusiasm and that grappling with the material that we hope to encourage in students. And the fact that they are able to give feedback and constructive criticism, they feel comfortable doing so, illustrates some of what Sophie was talking about relationship building in the classroom. So what we want you to think about and come out of today's session with is the idea that you can start to have a set of tools in your teaching toolbox that allow you to take all of those beautiful outcomes that we generated at the beginning, all the things that we see when our students are learning, all the things that our students can know, can tell us, can apply, can demonstrate, can teach to other people when they are learning, and develop course materials and courses that more effectively get us to those kinds of desired outcomes. So you've seen some practical examples of how to do that in some of the materials that we've shared. You've got a roadmap for how you can start to develop a journey towards building your own toolbox for evidence-based public health and engaging in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And just one final thing to mention, given that we are doing this live from Marc's basement and Sophie's living room and wherever else we are rather than in person, you know, over the past month, virtually all of us have fundamentally changed the way that we engage in teaching and learning with our students. And this webinar is certainly not the one that we originally envisioned doing as a workshop in person. But the beauty of that kind of principles of teaching and learning based practice that we talked about in the consuming part, and the idea of taking existing evidence-based practices from learning and development and applying them means that you can achieve the same pedagogical goals even when you are forced to be remote. And you can take, from an outcomes perspective, the kinds of learning outcomes that you would achieve in the classroom with students, and you can do them in a technology-based way, you know, just like we have here. And I think that's one of the beauties of that sort of approach to thinking about teaching and learning from an outcomes and a principles perspective, is it allows you to flex in the ways that we have all either willingly or unwillingly done as we've transitioned to online education. With that, we would like to open the floor up for your questions. So let me just give you a little orientation to doing that. Again, people can raise their hands and ask questions in the classroom, and on our webinar, you have a question and answer link down at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, type them there. You can press the question and answer button that's there at the bottom and type your question into the little box that appears above. Sophie and I will take some turns back and forth, kind of answering some of those questions. We'll get to as many as we can, and then we will honor everybody's time by wrapping up as we approach the 2 o'clock hour. So with that, I see one question already, which is what software program did you use to create and show the mind map? It's a program called MindNode that's available for Macintosh. There's several of them out there, and we can definitely provide some resources for doing that as we move forward. So thanks, Sophia, for that question, Beth.
Marc, it's Liz. There are a couple questions here. Here's one.
Okay.
Great ideas. Is there anything you might share in the realm of an epic fail that we could avoid in trying this out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go
do
ahead,
you want to go first, Marc? I have no examples, none.
So yeah, so I'm going to frame this a little bit, which is to say that, you know, we were talking some earlier about the sort of affective dimension of teaching and trying to build students' motivation and develop their self-efficacy. And I'm going to start by switching over the question to say, why is it good to fail? Because I would argue that there's some very real merit in trying things and falling flat on your face every once in a while in the classroom. You know, I think I teach evidence-based public health, which is a course that's all about selecting evidence-based interventions, adapting them for your context, and evaluating them. And of course, if they always worked well 100% of the time, there'd be no need to evaluate them. And so, you know, I try to use those failure moments as a demonstration that, yep, it happens, and how do you react to it? How do you pick up and move on? And then I think from the kind of affective dimension, you know, that Sophie talked about, one of the things that I've appreciated more and more and more over the course of my career is just how terrified our students are of failure, and being able to show them that it's okay is a good thing. So the answer is can I share examples of epic failures? We could be here for another hour, maybe more with sharing examples. I'd argue that it's a good thing, not a bad thing. Starting with existing practices, I think, and trying some things out. So the book that I showed on the slide, and I think the slides will be available on the website later. Student engagement practices is a bunch of things that people have tried for years. There's evidence that they work. There's evidence that they promote learning, and you really get a recipe for how to apply them in your classroom. Start with stuff like that, and then as you build your confidence and your self-efficacy and your motivation to do it, then branch out into the other stuff. I think would be my advice. Sophie?
Yeah, definitely. I would say start small. That part of this is about building trust. So we could also do an entire webinar. We could do like a day of what are all the barriers that we as faculty have to adopting these evidence-based practices. So we often have a lot of resistance, even ourselves, even if we're in the business of doing this, we'll say, oh, I can't do that. I have to give them the slides, right? Or I'll hear people say things like, well, but they won't learn if I don't, make them have a 90 slide deck PowerPoint. And my argument is always, they're not learning from your 90 PowerPoint slides, right? That the evidence shows that it's too much content. That's not how people make meaning of things, and that the learning is in the engagement and discussion and knocking ideas back and forth and trying things out. And so, but it's scary to give up control. So there are definitely some things that I think can help with that. And one of them is, don't try to throw the whole thing out tomorrow, that you can start small and then build your confidence. And so Marc, to reiterate something Marc said. And then another thing I would say is just that, again, I'm really more and more aware of how different I am with my classes in May than I am in January. So I think what I would do in May is really different than what I would do in January. So by the time we get to May, like, I know them, I know their names, I can count on them to do certain things. I know which ones are kind of a pain, which one's always on their phone, like, all that. And so if you're counting on them to bring the action or the meaning or um, the examples, right? I know what they'll do in April, and if I try that in January, I might just get blank looks, right?
Yeah. So I was looking at the question and answers that are coming in, and I'm going to kind of combine a couple of them in the interest of time. And Sophie, so one of the things that was asked was, you know, how do you create interest in a field, things like epidemiology? How can you, you kind of develop that interest and motivation for the field? And then I think that a question that came up that was kind of related to that is, if you move away from knowledge-based delivery to do these more engaging and more, you know, multimodal sort of teaching methods, how do you then construct assessments that match that style of teaching? Yeah.
Yes. So again, I think this is why we're so lucky to work in public health, because it's not, I always make fun of art history, which is rude and inappropriate, but you know, it's so practical. So I will pull up, I'll say, okay, you're going to do for your assignment, instead of writing, you know, a 30-page paper, you're going to respond to a fake grant proposal, right? Or sometimes even a real grant proposal, or you're going to develop a PowerPoint that is a interactive, activity-based teaching module. You're going to do the podcast. You're going to write an op-ed. You're going to write a 2-page briefing that you would give to your boss. So I try to make the assignments very practical, and I try to base them on things I was asked to do during my career, because what I find is that students are really proud of those, and they can use them for their professional, you know, they can use them as part of their portfolios for when they're applying for jobs. And it makes it a lot less like theoretical. So that brings in the, Marc's got all this great language about the motivation, right? And that's helpful.
And I'll just very briefly, because we're gonna have to wrap up in a minute, give an example of this. So for many years, this before I moved to the University of Kentucky, but I taught a course at the University of Buffalo that was an introduction to public health that was explicitly for all of the non-public health students who were at our college, because CEF has this requirement, right? That, you know, everybody has to have an introduction to public health course. And so, as you can imagine, you know, many of our physical therapists, occupational therapists, you know, nutritional master's students were not enthused about this, you know, and saw it as a kind of burdensome thing. So on the question of how do you motivate people and get them excited, there are two things that I tried to weave through that course. The first is making it as relevant to them as you possibly can. And so finding the examples of public health issues that are engaging. And in that particular context, I obviously did a lot of things around injury, around, you know, workplace kind of issues. We brought in policy approaches, you know, that were applicable to them. But you could do the same thing more broadly, you know. So vaping is something, when I talk with my undergraduates now, that is, you know, something of very real concern. They see their peers doing it, you know, they see advertisements for it, building courses around that. Those kinds of engagement things can take the dry, you know, material and make it more applicable. With respect to assessing, you know, one of the things that I did in that course is I had them do a final essay where they had to reflect on things they learned over the semester and how it applied to their field of study, right? So how will you be a better physical therapist because of doing this? And then what piece of advice, you know, would you give to somebody else? And what I said at the end was that it was perfectly fine for them to say that what they learned was not applicable to their profession, as long as they justified why, right? And so it's not so much that you have to say, like, this is something you're going to use every day, because for some of them they will, for some of them they won't. But can you think critically about what is and isn't applicable and how it does and doesn't apply? And out of a class of 150, you know, like each semester I would get like one student who told me that it didn't apply. But by using those techniques, you really do weave together and make things, you know, exciting and applicable for students. With that, there are some other wonderful questions here, and it is also a minute before before too, and I want to be respectful of people's time. So just on behalf of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning group and the teaching subcommittee, it was been great to talk to all of you. Loved what we're doing. Sophie, thank you so much for being part of it. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to turn it back over to Liz, who is going to tell you just a couple of more things on behalf of ASPPH.
Thank you, Mark and Sophie. A hearty round of virtual applause for our presenters. That was really dynamic. After the webinar concludes, shortly after, we'll have a archived session on the ASPPH website where you see it here. If you are a CPH holder, we encourage you to put in for CPH continuing ed credits. And there's more. Trying to advance the slides here. There we go. Thanks to your all sharing with us your research, teaching, and practice activities in support of fighting the virus. We have a new hub that lists all the exciting things that you're doing, and including the work we're doing with our practice and community partners, particularly health departments, on this effort. We have a number of webinars still forthcoming as part of our virtual annual meeting. There's one in about 30 minutes, developing and delivering training for critical skills for the public health workforce. You could catch that at 2:30. Next Friday are 3 more webinars, and these continue on until May 15th. If you hang on just a minute, if time permits, once the webinar wraps up, you can answer a really quick, just a couple question evaluation. We'd really appreciate it to improve how we're delivering this material to you. If it's meeting your needs, let us know, or what we could do better. And in closing, we want to celebrate you, all of you, educators in public health, and we encourage you to keep calm and carry on using the evidence for teaching and learning in public health. This concludes the webinar.